The atmosphere within the pressurized transit lock of the orbital station Ocular Prime hummed with the low-frequency vibration of the secondary fusion scrubbers, a sound that resonated in the marrow of citizen Alistair Vane's bones as he waited for the seals to equalize. This was the final threshold before the descent into the gravity well of the planet below, a world designated in the stellar charts as Prox 9, but known to its indentured inhabitants simply as the Marrow. Alistair adjusted the restrictive collar of his environmental suit, the stiff polymer scraping against his jawline as he stared through the reinforced transparency at the swirling, ochre clouds that veiled the surface. He was not a man of sentiment, yet the sheer scale of the atmospheric turbulence gave him a momentary pause, a flicker of hesitation that he quickly suppressed with a practiced mental exercise involving the visualization of the structural schematics he had been sent to evaluate. The mission was straightforward in theory: determine why the subterranean pressure domes were losing structural integrity at a rate that defied the predictive models of the central engineering hive. If he succeeded, his standing within the Technocratic Assembly would be solidified. If he failed, he would likely be reassigned to the waste reclamation sectors of the Outer Belt, a fate he considered worse than total biological cessation. The chime of the airlock finally signaled a successful pressure match, and the heavy iris doors spiraled open with a hiss of escaping nitrogen. Alistair stepped forward into the narrow corridor of the descent shuttle, his boots clanking against the perforated metal flooring. He was joined by a small group of silent laborers, their faces obscured by the tinted visors of their industrial-grade respirators. These were the men and women who kept the gears of the Marrow turning, individuals whose identities were reduced to alphanumeric strings in the grand ledger of the assembly. He took a seat in the cramped passenger module, buckling the 5-point harness across his chest as the shuttle's pilot began the pre-ignition sequence. The jolt of the thrusters firing was sudden and violent, slamming him back into the padded seat as the vessel detached from the station and began its screaming plunge into the upper ionosphere. Outside the small porthole, the orange sky turned to a deep, bruised purple as the heat shield began to glow with the friction of their re-entry. Alistair closed his eyes, focusing on the rhythm of his own breathing, trying to ignore the way the shuttle groaned under the immense aerodynamic stresses. Minutes felt like hours as the turbulence rattled his teeth, the descent module buffeting through the dense, high-pressure layers of the planet's atmosphere. This was a world where the air was thick enough to swim in, a soup of corrosive gases and suspended minerals that would strip the skin from a man's bones in seconds if the seals of his suit ever failed. The Marrow was a treasure trove of rare earth elements and exotic isotopes, but it was a treasure guarded by an environment that was fundamentally hostile to carbon-based life. As the shuttle finally broke through the lowest cloud layer, the vast expanse of the northern mining plains came into view. It was a landscape of jagged obsidian spires and glowing magma vents, crisscrossed by the shimmering ribbons of the maglev tracks that connected the various pressure domes. The shuttle angled toward Dome 04, the largest and oldest of the terrestrial settlements, a massive hemisphere of reinforced polyglass that looked like a dropped marble in a field of jagged glass. The landing was rough, a series of heavy thuds as the landing struts absorbed the impact, followed by the high-pitched whine of the cooling fans as they fought to dissipate the heat of re-entry. When the hatch opened, Alistair was greeted by the oppressive weight of the dome's artificial gravity, which was set to a grueling 1.2 standard GS to counteract the long-term effects of bone density loss in the workers. He unbuckled his harness and stood, his legs feeling heavy and sluggish as he moved toward the exit. Waiting for him on the landing pad was a tall, gaunt man named Supervisor Valerius, whose face was a map of deep-set wrinkles and chemical burns. Valerius did not offer a hand in greeting, nor did he smile. Such pleasantries were a luxury that the Marrow did not afford its residents. Instead, the supervisor simply nodded toward a waiting crawler and began walking, his gait a strange, lurching hop that suggested he had spent too many years in the variable gravity of the lower mines. Alistair followed him, his eyes scanning the interior of the dome. It was a sprawling metropolis of tiered steel platforms and hanging gardens of bioluminescent moss, illuminated by the harsh glare of the overhead sodium lamps. The air here smelled of ozone and recycled sweat, a pungent cocktail that Alistair found difficult to stomach after the sterile environment of the orbital station. They boarded the crawler, a heavy, treaded vehicle designed to navigate the uneven terrain of the dome's interior. As they lurched forward, Valerius finally spoke, his voice a raspy whisper that barely carried over the roar of the engine. He explained that the seismic activity in the southern quadrants had increased tenfold over the last lunar cycle, and that the foundation of the primary reactor was beginning to show signs of molecular fatigue. This was impossible, according to Alistair's data. The foundation was anchored into the planetary crust with carbon nanotube pilings that should have been able to withstand a tectonic shift of magnitude 9. Yet, as they approached the reactor site, Alistair saw the evidence for himself. The massive pillars of reinforced concrete were webbed with fine, glowing cracks, as if something from deep within the earth was pulsing with an energy that the material could not contain. He stepped out of the crawler, his handheld scanner already active, the screen flickering with a chaotic array of readings that suggested a localized distortion in the gravitational field. The deeper Alistair investigated the site, the more he realized that this was not a simple case of material failure. The cracks in the pillars were not static. They were moving, albeit slowly, flowing like liquid glass in a pattern that seemed almost intentional. He knelt down to get a closer look at a particularly large fissure, the sensors in his suit warning him of a spike in electromagnetic radiation. As he reached out a gloved hand to touch the glowing surface, he felt a strange vibration, a hum that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his mind. It was a sound of immense age and cold, indifferent power, a voice from a time before the first stars had even begun to coalesce from the primordial gas clouds. He jerked his hand back, his heart racing, as the ground beneath him gave a sudden, violent heave. The alarm sirens of the dome began to wail, a shrill, piercing sound that cut through the background noise of the machinery. Valerius shouted something, his arm outstretched toward the horizon, where a massive plume of purple gas was erupting from the floor of the dome, shattering the polyglass floor like a pane of ice. Chaos erupted as the workers scrambled for the emergency shelters, their voices lost in the roar of the escaping atmosphere. Alistair stood his ground, his eyes fixed on the eruption, watching as a monolithic shape began to rise from the depths of the planet. It was a structure of impossible geometry, a tower of shifting planes and angles that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. It was not made of stone or metal, but of a substance that flickered between solid and light, a crystalline lattice that pulsed with the same violet energy he had seen in the cracks of the foundation. He realized then that the Marrow was not just a mining colony, it was a cage, and the thing they had been digging toward for decades was finally waking up. The pressure in the dome began to drop rapidly as the breach widened, the internal atmosphere venting into the toxic world outside. Alistair felt the air being sucked from his lungs, his environmental suit struggling to compensate for the sudden change. He looked up at the towering monolith, a sense of profound insignificance washing over him as he understood that the history of his species was about to be rewritten by a force they could neither understand nor control. As the dome's structural integrity finally failed, the massive polyglass ceiling began to shatter into millions of lethal shards, raining down on the city below. Alistair dove for cover beneath the chassis of the crawler, his fingers clawing at the metallic floor as the world around him turned into a whirlwind of debris and screaming wind. He watched through the gaps in the vehicle's treads as Supervisor Valerius was swept away by a sudden gust, his body tumbling into the darkness of the deepening abyss. The ground continued to break apart, the very bedrock of the planet splintering as the crystalline entity continued its ascent. It was as if the world itself was being turned inside out, the buried secrets of 1 billion years rising to reclaim the surface. In the distance, the orbital station Ocular Prime was a tiny speck of light in the darkening sky, a distant witness to the destruction of the colony. Alistair knew then that there would be no rescue, no escape. The descent into the Marrow had been a one-way trip, and the true nature of the planet was far more terrifying than any of them had ever dared to imagine. He gripped the underside of the crawler, his knuckles white, as the darkness finally swallowed the dome, and the screams of the dying were silenced by the roar of the awakening Earth. The transition from the deafening roar of the atmospheric collapse to the pressurized interior of the emergency subterranean bunker was a sensory shock that left Alistair Vane gasping for oxygen. He had been dragged through the primary airlock by a pair of automated recovery drones, their hydraulic limbs indifferent to the bruises they left on his ribs as they hauled his limp form into the safety of the reinforced substrata. The air inside the bunker was stale, thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of emergency chemical scrubbers, but it was breathable. He lay on the cold floor for several minutes, his chest heaving as the internal computer of his environmental suit synchronized with the local network, flashing a series of amber warnings across his retina. The external sensors of the suit were dead, sheared off during the descent into the abyss, leaving him blind to the world above. He rolled onto his side, his vision swimming with phosphenes, and watched as the heavy blast doors of the bunker cycled shut with a finality that echoed through the small, circular chamber. There were others there, perhaps 20 survivors in total, huddled on the tiered metal benches that lined the walls, their faces ghostly in the flickering emerald light of the auxiliary power cells. Among the survivors was a woman named Senior Tech Archivist Vespera, a high-ranking member of the planetary data hive whose presence in the lower levels was as unexpected as the catastrophe itself. She sat with a portable data slate clutched to her chest, her fingers moving in a frantic, rhythmic pattern across its glowing surface. Alistair forced himself to stand, his joints protesting the lingering effects of the high-gravity environment, and stumbled toward her. He needed to know if the orbital station had been alerted, if there was any protocol for a planetary-scale structural failure of this magnitude. Vespera looked up as he approached, her eyes wide and bloodshot, reflecting the scrolling lines of code that danced across her screen. She did not wait for him to speak, instead turning the slate toward him to reveal a terrifying visualization of the planet's internal geometry. The seismic sensors were no longer recording tectonic shifts. They were recording movement, a massive, coordinated expansion of the crystalline lattice that Alistair had witnessed rising from the floor of the dome. The data suggested that the monolith was not an isolated structure, but part of a planetary-wide network, a dormant biological or mechanical system that occupied nearly 40% of the mantle. As the mining lasers of the assembly had bitten deeper into the crust over the last century, They had inadvertently acted as a catalyst, providing the thermal energy and isotopic vibrations necessary to trigger a systemic awakening. Vespera explained, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and professional fascination, that the cracks Alistair had seen in the reactor foundation were actually conduits, neural pathways for an intelligence that operated on a scale of millennia rather than seconds. The Marrow was not a planet in the traditional sense. It was an organism, or perhaps a vessel, and the humans who had lived upon it were nothing more than parasites whose scratching had finally irritated the host into action. The purple gas that had erupted was a byproduct of this awakening, a concentrated neurotoxin that was currently dissolving the organic components of the upper colonies, turning the lush biogardens and the bodies of the workers into a slurry of raw carbon. Alistair felt a cold chill settle in his stomach as he realized the implications of her words. If the entire planet was responding to their presence, then the emergency bunkers were not sanctuaries, they were traps. He looked around the chamber, noticing for the first time that the walls were beginning to vibrate with the same low-frequency hum he had felt near the reactor. The sound was deeper here, more resonant, a thrumming that seemed to vibrate his very teeth. He moved to the central console of the bunker, overriding the security lock with his technocratic assembly credentials to access the external cameras. Most of the feeds were static, but one high-altitude drone managed to transmit a final, grainy image before its optics melted. The surface of the Marrow was no longer recognizable. The jagged obsidian plains had been replaced by a shimmering sea of violet glass, and the atmosphere was thick with floating geometric shapes that drifted through the ochre clouds like predatory fish. The orbital station, once a beacon of safety, was nowhere to be seen, likely forced to break orbit or destroyed by the initial shockwave of the planetary expansion. The bunker shuddered violently as a massive tremor rocked the substrata, throwing several survivors from their benches. A section of the ceiling buckled, a fine dust of pulverized concrete raining down on the group. Vespera grabbed Alistair's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. She pointed to the data slate, where a new set of readings was emerging. The crystalline network was seeking out the largest concentrations of thermal energy, which meant the fusion cores of the emergency bunkers were being targeted. They had less than an hour before the ground beneath them dissolved into the same liquid glass that had swallowed the dome. There was only one way out, a secondary ventilation shaft that led to an abandoned research outpost in the Northern Highlands, a facility built before the mining operations had become fully automated. It was a journey of nearly 20 kilometers through the subterranean maintenance tunnels, a labyrinth of dark, unpressurized pipes and crumbling service corridors that had not been inspected in decades. Alistair addressed the group, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He explained the situation with the clinical detachment of his training, omitting the more horrific details of Vespera's theories. Most of the laborers looked at him with hollow eyes, their spirits broken by the loss of their world and the weight of the gravity. Only a few, including a rugged excavation foreman named Cass and a young medical initiate, showed any sign of movement. They gathered what supplies they could, emergency oxygen canisters, portable torches, and a few outdated multi-tools, before prying open the rusted hatch of the ventilation shaft. The air that puffed out was freezing and smelled of ancient dust, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the bunker. Alistair led the way, his torch cutting a narrow path through the darkness, the beam reflecting off the condensation that clung to the iron walls of the shaft. The climb was grueling, a vertical ascent of several hundred meters that required them to haul themselves up a series of narrow rungs. Alistair could hear the heavy breathing of the survivors behind him, the rhythmic clink of their gear against the metal. As they climbed, the hum from the planet grew louder, a thrumming that felt like a physical weight pressing against their chests. It was a song of the deep earth, a sound that spoke of the birth of galaxies and the cooling of suns. Vespera, climbing just below him, whispered that the frequency was changing, becoming more complex, as if the planet was trying to communicate with itself across the vast distances of its own body. He ignored her, focusing only on the next rung, the next breath, the next meter of progress. He could not afford to think about the nature of the entity they were disturbing. His only goal was survival, a primitive drive that overridden even his most deeply held scientific convictions. They reached the primary maintenance level after what felt like hours of climbing. The tunnel here was wider, though the floor was slick, with a black, oily substance that Alistair did not care to identify. They moved in a tight formation, their torches scanning the shadows for any sign of the crystalline growth. It was here that they saw the first signs of the transformation. The walls of the tunnel were no longer entirely metal. In places, the steel had been replaced by translucent veins of violet quartz that pulsed with a soft, rhythmic light. Where the quartz touched the metal, the steel appeared to be melting, the two substances fusing into a new, hybrid material that defied conventional metallurgical analysis. Alistair stopped to take a reading, his scanner confirming that the quartz was drawing energy directly from the tunnel's emergency lighting system. The planet was not just waking up, it was consuming the technology they had left behind, integrating it into its own vast, incomprehensible architecture. As they pushed deeper into the tunnels, the temperature began to rise, the cooling systems of the facility clearly failing as the geothermal heat of the planet intensified. Kars, the foreman, took the lead, his knowledge of the facility's layout proving invaluable as they navigated a series of branching corridors that had been partially collapsed by the seismic activity. They encountered a blockage near the halfway point, a massive pile of rubble that completely sealed the path. Alistair and Kars worked together to clear a narrow opening, their hands bleeding as they moved heavy chunks of reinforced masonry. It was during this work that they heard it, a sound that was not the hum of the planet, but something else. It was a skittering noise, the sound of many small, hard objects clicking against the metal floor. Alistair swung his torch toward the sound, the light revealing a swarm of small, spider-like constructs made of the same shifting glass as the monolith. The constructs did not attack immediately. Instead, they hovered at the edge of the light, their multifaceted eyes reflecting the torch beam like thousands of tiny diamonds. They were scavenging, stripping the copper wiring from the walls and carrying it back into the darkness. Vespera gasped, her data slate recording a surge in local electromagnetic activity. These were the planet's antibodies, the microscopic agents of its will, tasked with cleaning the infection of human technology from its surface. One of the survivors, panicked by the sight of the glass spiders, lashed out with a heavy wrench, shattering one of the constructs into a cloud of shimmering dust. The reaction from the swarm was instantaneous. The clicking noise rose to a deafening screech as the glass spiders surged forward, their limbs sharpening into crystalline blades. Alistair shouted for the group to run, the survivors scrambling through the narrow opening they had cleared as the swarm descended upon the man who had struck the blow. The screams of the lost laborer echoed through the tunnel, a sound that Alistair knew would haunt him if he lived long enough to have memories. They did not look back, sprinting through the darkness as the glass spiders gave chase, their movements fluid and terrifyingly fast. The group reached a heavy pressure door, Alistair slamming his weight against the manual override lever just as the first of the constructs reached them. The door slid shut with a heavy thud, the sound of the spiders scratching against the other side like rain on a tin roof. They were safe for the moment, but the group was now reduced by one, and the reality of their situation was becoming increasingly clear. They were not just running from a collapsing world, they were being hunted by it. Alistair leaned against the door, his chest heaving, his eyes meeting Vespera's in the dim light. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the violet veins that were already beginning to sprout from the seams of the door they had just closed. The northern research outpost was still several kilometers away, and the path ahead was fraught with even greater dangers. The air in the tunnel was becoming increasingly thin, the oxygen levels dropping as the planetary transformation consumed the last of the dome's atmosphere. Alistair knew they had to keep moving, that any delay would be fatal. He pushed himself away from the door, gesturing for the others to follow. They moved in silence now, the only sound the rhythmic thud of their boots and the distant, ever-present hum of the marrow. The world of the technocratic assembly, with its orderly charts and predictable laws, felt like a dream from a previous life. Here, in the dark heart of a living world, the only law was the law of the abyss, and Alistair Vane was beginning to realize that the glass horizon was closer than he had ever imagined. The transition from the horizontal maintenance corridors to the primary vertical conduit of the Northern Research Outpost was marked by a harrowing traverse across a suspended gantry that groaned under the shifting gravitational stresses of the planet. Alistair Vane led the diminished group, his boots finding purchase on the rusted open grate flooring, while the violet luminescence from the walls below cast long, distorted shadows against the jagged rock of the cavern. The air here was thin and frigid, stripped of the moisture that usually circulated within the dome's climate-controlled sectors, leaving his throat raw and his lungs burning with every inhalation. Behind him, Vespera stumbled, her fingers white-knuckled as she gripped the guide rail, her data slate now emitting a low-pitched whine as it struggled to process the cascading anomalies of the local magnetic field. Cass and the medical initiate followed, their movements robotic and drained of the urgency that had propelled them through the lower tunnels. They were entering the transitional zone where the planetary crust met the reinforced foundations of the Old World Research Facility, a place where the hubris of the early explorers was etched into the very stone in the form of abandoned bore drills and discarded atmospheric stabilizers. Alistair paused at the midpoint of the gantry, his torch beam sweeping across the vast darkness of the central shaft. Far below, he could see the encroaching tide of the crystalline lattice, a slow-moving ocean of geometric light that was steadily consuming the structural supports of the outpost. It was not a chaotic growth. It was a methodical reconstruction, the glass spiders and larger, more complex drones weaving a new reality from the atoms of the old. He watched as a massive steel support beam was enveloped by the violet quartz, the metal seemingly turning to liquid before being incorporated into a soaring arch of translucent crystal. The sight was hypnotic and terrifying, a glimpse into a biological process that operated on a scale of molecular precision. Vespera moved to his side, her breath hitching in her throat as she adjusted the settings on her slate. She whispered that the energy readings were no longer fluctuating, but had stabilized into a rhythmic pulse, a heartbeat of the world that was synchronized with the orbital mechanics of the system's primary star. The research outpost, designated as Station Alpha 9, appeared ahead of them like a ghost ship frozen in a sea of stone. Its external hull was scarred by centuries of micrometeorite impacts and chemical erosion, but the heavy blast doors remained sealed, a testament to the durability of the pre-automation era. Alistair reached the primary airlock, his hands trembling as he interfaced his command override with the ancient terminal. The hardware was sluggish, the screen flickering with amber text that had long since been phased out by the technocratic assembly. He bypassed the security protocols, the mechanical locks disengaging with a series of heavy, metallic thuds that echoed through the hollow shaft. As the doors slid open, a gust of pressurized, recycled air hit them, carrying the faint scent of dried paper and ancient lubricants. This facility had been abandoned for 50 years, preserved in the vacuum of the high-altitude peaks, a time capsule of an era when humanity still believed it could master the marrow through sheer force of will. They stepped into the darkness of the main laboratory, their torches illuminating rows of glass specimen jars and dormant computer terminals. It was a cathedral of forgotten science, a place where the first surveyors had attempted to decode the planet's unique geology. Alistair felt a strange sense of reverence as he walked past the dust-covered equipment, his mind racing with the possibility that the answers to their current predicament might be buried in the archives of this very room. He directed Cass and the initiate to check the emergency power reserves and the oxygen scrubbers, while he and Vespera moved toward the central data core. The core was a massive cylinder of optical glass, its internal filaments dim and unresponsive. Vespera connected her slate to the terminal, her fingers flying across the interface as she attempted to jump-start the system. For several tense minutes, the only sound was the hum of the cooling fans and the distant, muffled thuds of the planetary transformation outside. Suddenly, the data core flared to life, a column of brilliant blue light illuminating the room and casting sharp shadows against the walls. The screens surrounding the terminal began to scroll with archived logs, some dating back to the initial landing of the first expedition. Alistair leaned in, his eyes scanning the text for any mention of the crystalline structures. He found a series of entries authored by a chief geologist named Sorensen, who had been the first to posit that the Marrow's rare earth deposits were not natural formations, but were the byproduct of a dormant, terraforming engine. Sorensen had warned that the extraction of these minerals would eventually destabilize the equilibrium of the engine, leading to a reclamation event. The assembly had suppressed these findings, labeling Sorensen a terminal eccentric and relocating him to a fringe colony, but the data remained, a silent warning that had gone unheeded for nearly a century. The reclamation event was not an accident. It was a programmed response to the depletion of the planet's internal resources. As Alistair read further, the floor beneath them began to tilt, the entire station groaning as the crystalline growth below began to exert upward pressure on the foundations. Vespera pointed to a schematic that had appeared on the main screen, a map of the planet's core showing a series of concentrated energy points. These points were the control nodes of the terraforming engine, and the largest one was located directly beneath the northern highlands. If they could reach the node, they might be able to interface with the system and signal a cessation of the reclamation process. It was a desperate plan, a literal shot in the dark, but it was the only alternative to a slow death in the collapsing tunnels. Alistair looked at the survivors, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of the data core. They were exhausted, terrified, and broken, but the prospect of a goal, however impossible, seemed to ignite a final spark of determination in their eyes. They spent the next hour scavenging the lab for supplies, finding a cache of high-altitude environmental suits and several portable plasma cutters. Alistair discovered a prototype long-range transmitter that had been designed to pierce the atmospheric interference of the Marrow's upper layers. If they reached the control node, they could use the transmitter to send a distress signal to any surviving ships in the system, or perhaps even to the assembly's central relay on the outer belt. The medical initiate tended to the injuries of the group, her hands steady as she applied synthetic skin grafts to the chemical burns on Cass' arms. There was a grim efficiency to their movements now, a shared understanding that they were the last remnants of the colony, the final witnesses to the death of a world. The hum of the planet continued to intensify, the frequency now so high that it caused the glass specimen jars to vibrate and shatter, raining shards of transparent material onto the floor. The path to the control node lay through the lower observation decks, a section of the station that had been built into the natural cavern system of the highlands. As they descended the spiral staircase, the air became thick with a fine violet mist that shimmered in the beams of their torches. This was the neurotoxin in its gaseous form, a concentrated vapor that even the high-altitude suits might struggle to filter. Alistair checked the seals of his helmet, the internal display showing a steady decline in the integrity of the carbon filters. They moved with cautious speed, their boots clicking against the metal stairs, the sound amplified by the acoustics of the cavern. They reached the observation deck, a wide semicircle of reinforced windows that looked out over the northern valley. What they saw made them stop in their tracks, the sheer scale of the transformation finally becoming clear. The entire valley had been converted into a massive crystalline forest, with towers of violet glass reaching hundreds of meters into the ochre sky. The trees were not static, they were pulsing with light, their branches swaying in an invisible wind as they absorbed the thermal energy from the ground. In the center of the forest stood the control node, a colossal pyramid of black obsidian that seemed to absorb the light around it. It was surrounded by a ring of the glass spiders, thousands of them moving in a coordinated dance as they maintained the structural integrity of the pyramid. The air outside the windows was a swirling vortex of purple gas and lightning, the planetary engine now operating at peak capacity. Alistair knew that the walk from the station to the pyramid would be a death sentence without a vehicle, but the station's hangar was located on the opposite side of the facility, and the seismic activity had already collapsed the connecting corridors. Cass gestured toward a heavy-duty mining skiff that was tethered to the external docking rail of the observation deck. It was a rugged, open-air vehicle designed for short-range mineral scouting, its chassis reinforced with lead shielding to protect against radiation. It was their only chance. Alistair approached the airlock that led to the docking rail, the pressure differential causing a sharp hiss as the seals broke. The wind outside was a physical force, a howling gale that carried the scent of scorched metal and ancient ice. He climbed into the pilot's seat of the skiff, the controls unfamiliar but intuitive enough for a man of his technical background. The others piled into the back, huddling together for warmth as the skiff's engine roared to life, a sound that felt pathetically small against the backdrop of the planetary awakening. He disengaged the tether, and the skiff plummeted toward the valley floor, the thrusters fighting to maintain stability in the turbulent air. The descent was a blur of violet light and jagged shadows as Alistair navigated the skiff through the crystalline forest. The glass spiders ignored them, their focus entirely on the construction of the pyramid, but the environmental hazards were nearly overwhelming. Massive shards of falling crystal whistled past the skiff, and the electrical discharge from the atmosphere scorched the hull, sending sparks flying into the passenger compartment. Vespera clung to the data slate, her eyes fixed on the navigation sensors as she guided Alistair toward the heart of the obsidian pyramid. They were closing the distance, the black structure looming over them like a silent god, its surface etched with glowing runes that vibrated at a frequency that made Alistair's vision blur. He slammed the skiff into the base of the pyramid, the landing struts snapping under the force of the impact, and the group scrambled out of the wreckage just as the vehicle's fuel cells ignited in a brilliant flash of orange flame. They stood at the entrance of the control node, a massive triangular opening that led into the heart of the mountain. The air here was strangely still, the howling wind of the valley silenced by the immense mass of the obsidian walls. Alistair led the way into the darkness, his torch beam revealing a corridor of polished stone that felt more like a tomb than a machine. The walls were lined with thousands of small, flickering lights, each one a data point in the planet's vast neural network. He could feel the weight of the machine's consciousness, a presence that was both alien and ancient, watching them with a cold, analytical curiosity. They reached the central chamber, a vast space dominated by a suspended sphere of liquid light that pulsed with a rhythmic, violet glow. This was the heart of the marrow, the processing core of the terraforming engine, and the final destination of their journey. Vespera moved toward the interface console, her hands trembling as she prepared to connect her data slate to the core. Alistair stood guard, his plasma cutter held at the ready, though he knew it would be useless against the power of the entity they were facing. The air in the chamber began to hum, the sound rising in pitch until it was a piercing scream that forced them to their knees. The liquid light in the sphere began to shift, forming shapes and patterns that were both beautiful and terrifying. It was a visualization of the planet's history, the birth of the engine, and the slow, agonizing depletion of its resources by the human colonies. Alistair realized then that there was no negotiation to be had. The machine was not broken, and it was not malfunctioning. It was fulfilling its primary directive, and they were the refuse that was being cleared away. He watched as Vespera's slate was incinerated by a sudden surge of energy, the woman falling back with a cry of despair. The glass horizon was no longer a metaphor. It was the end of their story and the beginning of something new. The failure of the data slate was a physical blow to the morale of the group, a spark of hope extinguished in the oppressive violet gloom of the obsidian chamber. Alistair Vane watched as the charred remains of the device fell from Vespera's fingers, the plastic casing bubbling and emitting a thin wisp of acrid smoke that was quickly sucked into the chamber's cyclopean ventilation grates. They were standing at the literal center of the world's intelligence, a place where the physical laws of the technocratic assembly were subordinated to the needs of a planetary-scale metabolism. The central sphere of liquid light continued to pulse, its rhythm now matching the frantic thumping of Alistair's own heart. He moved to the interface console, his hands hovering over the haptic sensors which were not made of buttons or screens, but of a shifting, gelatinous mercury that seemed to respond to the electrical field of his fingertips. He could feel the engine's immense power through the floor, a vibration so intense it made his vision blur and his equilibrium falter. Cass and the medical initiate were backed against the entrance, their torches sweeping the shadows as if expecting the glass spiders to manifest from the very air. The silence within the control node was absolute, a vacuum of sound that seemed to press against Alistair's eardrums until he felt they might burst. He looked at Vespera, who was staring at the sphere with an expression of profound, nihilistic awe. Her purpose had been tied to the data she could process, and without her instruments, she was a ghost in a machine that did not recognize her existence. Alistair realized that the traditional methods of communication, binary code, linguistic algorithms, or even the basic mathematical constants, were likely too primitive for an entity that managed the tectonic and atmospheric variables of an entire planet. He closed his eyes and pressed his palms directly into the cool, shifting surface of the console. The sensation was instantaneous and overwhelming, a flood of sensory data that bypassed his optic nerves and seated itself directly in his consciousness. He saw the marrow not as a sphere of rock and ore, but as a complex web of energy filaments, a vast circuit board where every mountain was a resistor and every sea of magma was a battery. In this state of hyperconnectivity, Alistair understood the true scale of the reclamation event they had triggered. The human mining operations had not just been stealing minerals, they had been severing the planet's nervous system. Every shaft sunk into the crust, every explosive charge detonated in the deep vents had been a lobotomy performed on a Titan. The engine was now rerouting its power, closing the gaps in its neural architecture by consuming the very things that had caused the damage. He felt the cold indifference of the machine, a logic that viewed the death of the human colony as a necessary sterilization. There was no malice in the violet light, only a profound, mechanical hunger for order. He tried to project a thought, a plea for the survivors, but his mind felt like a candle flame held against a hurricane. The engine was not interested in individuals. It was focused on the restoration of the planetary equilibrium. A sudden lurch of the entire structure nearly threw Alistair from the console as the obsidian pyramid began to sink deeper into the crust. The floor beneath them groaned, the sound of grinding stone echoing through the chamber as the node began its descent toward the mantle. This was the next phase of the process. The internal components of the engine were retreating to the core, drawing the surface materials down with them to be recycled in the white-hot heat of the planetary forge. Cars shouted a warning, his voice cracking with terror, as the triangular entrance through which they had come began to contract, the obsidian walls flowing like wax to seal the chamber. They were being entombed within the heart of the engine, a final destination from which there would be no return. The medical initiate collapsed, her hands over her ears as the high-frequency hum reached a pitch that caused the very molecules of the air to vibrate. Alistair fought the urge to pull his hands away from the console, knowing that his connection to the machine was the only thread of control they had left. He began to visualize the schematics he had memorized on the orbital station, focusing on the emergency venting systems of the Northern Research Outpost. If he could find the specific frequency that governed the atmospheric stabilizers, he might be able to create a localized pressure bubble, a momentary reprieve that would allow the station's remaining escape pods to launch. It was a long shot, a desperate attempt to use the engine's own power against its directives. He pushed his mind deeper into the liquid light, ignoring the searing pain that began to radiate behind his eyes. He saw the network of conduits that led back to Station Alpha 9, tracing the flow of energy through the crystalline forest and up the jagged spires of the highlands. With a final, agonizing effort, Alistair forced a surge of his own neural energy into the console, a mental scream that rippled through the planetary circuit. For a heartbeat, the liquid sphere turned a brilliant, blinding white, and the hum of the engine stalled, a momentary stutter in the heartbeat of the world. In that instant, he felt a series of mechanical locks disengaging miles above them. The emergency power at the research outpost flickered to life, and the seals on the primary hangar deck were blown open by a sudden release of pressurized gas. He had given whoever was left at the station a window of exactly 3 minutes before the reclamation resumed its pace. But the cost was total. The feedback from the engine's core surged back through the console, slamming into Alistair with the force of a physical impact. He was thrown backward across the floor, his environmental suit sparking as the electronics were fried by the electromagnetic pulse. He lay on the cold obsidian, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as the world spun around him. Vespera crawled toward him, her hands trembling as she checked the integrity of his suit's life support. The display on his wrist was dark, the glass cracked and useless. He tried to speak, but his tongue felt like lead, and the only sound he could produce was a wet, rattling cough. Carr stood over them, his torch flickering as the batteries finally began to fail. The foreman looked up at the ceiling, which was now glowing with a soft, bioluminescent purple as the chamber continued its descent. There was no way out. The entrance was completely sealed, and the temperature in the room was beginning to rise as they approached the thermal layers of the mantle. They were the first and last humans to witness the heart of the marrow, a privilege that carried a terminal price. The medical initiate moved to Alistair's side, her face pale but determined as she opened her kit. She knew there was nothing she could do for the fried circuitry of his suit, so she focused on the man inside, administering a sedative to dull the pain of the radiation burns that were already blooming across his chest. She whispered words of comfort that Alistair could barely hear over the roar of the descending pyramid. He watched the liquid sphere, which had returned to its rhythmic, violet pulse. It seemed almost peaceful now, the violent surges of the awakening replaced by a steady, purposeful crawl toward the planetary core. He realized that his intervention had been nothing more than a glitch to the engine, a momentary interference that had already been corrected. Yet, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had done the one thing the Technocratic Assembly had always claimed was impossible. He had touched the soul of a world. As the heat in the chamber became unbearable, Vespera sat down beside Alistair, leaning her head against the obsidian wall. She no longer looked for her data slate or her lost archives. Instead, she watched the patterns in the liquid light, her eyes reflecting the complex geometries of the engine's thoughts. She began to hum a low, wordless tune, a sound that Alistair found oddly familiar, though he knew he had never heard it before. It was a melody of the deep earth, a resonance that seemed to harmonize with the hum of the pyramid. Cass joined them, sitting on the floor with his back to the console, his heavy hands resting on his knees. They were no longer a technocrat, a tech archivist, a foreman, and an initiate. They were simply living things, huddled together in the dark as the world they had known was unmade around them. The obsidian walls began to glow with a dull red heat, and the air grew thick with the scent of melting minerals. Alistair's vision began to fade, the violet light of the sphere blurring into a single, shimmering point. He thought of the orbital station, wondering if the escape pods had made it out, if anyone would ever hear the message he had tried to send. He hoped they would not come back. The marrow was not a place for humanity. It was a sanctuary of glass and light that demanded a solitude they were incapable of providing. The final sensation he felt was not the heat, but a sudden, weightless drift, as if the gravity had finally been neutralized. He felt himself expanding, his consciousness dissolving into the crystalline lattice, becoming a part of the very engine he had tried to fight. The glass horizon was no longer in the distance. It was everywhere, a brilliant, all-consuming fire that turned the darkness into a mirror of the stars. In the heart of the obsidian tomb, the 4 survivors became the final data points in a new planetary epoch, their atoms scattered into the violet light of the awakening world. The pyramid reached the mantle, its structure merging with the molten currents of the planet's interior. The surface of the marrow continued its transformation, the ochre clouds thinning to reveal a sky of deep, midnight blue. The crystalline forests grew taller, their branches reaching out to harvest the radiation of the sun, turning the planet into a shimmering jewel in the black velvet of space. There were no more domes, no more mines, no more alphanumeric strings. The planet was whole again, a silent, beautiful entity that drifted through the void, oblivious to the small, broken things that had once crawled upon its skin. The legacy of the technocratic assembly was reduced to a few drifting shards of polyglass in the upper atmosphere, and the story of Alistair Vane was written in the shifting patterns of the liquid light at the core, a brief, flickering moment of interference in the eternal song of the glass horizon. The sensation of dissolution was not the end that Alistair Vane had anticipated, nor was it the cold void of cessation. Instead, he found his consciousness suspended in a state of quantum entanglement with the very foundations of the Northern Control Node. The physical heat that had been threatening to incinerate his biological form seemed to recede, replaced by a crystalline clarity that allowed him to perceive the subterranean architecture of the marrow as a series of interconnected data streams. He was no longer Alistair Vane, the displaced technocrat. He was a transient ghost in the planetary shell, his neural patterns being preserved by the engine as a complex anomaly worth further observation. He looked out, not with eyes, but with the array of seismic sensors and electromagnetic receptors that formed the planet's sensory perimeter. Above him, the obsidian pyramid had integrated fully into the lithosphere, and the pressure bubble he had forced into existence at Station Alpha 9 was still holding, a tiny pocket of defiance against the crushing weight of the transformation. He could feel the three remaining pulses of life within the chamber with him, Vespera, Kars, and the Initiate, their biological signatures faint but steady, encased in a protective field of solidified violet energy that the engine had spontaneously generated. This unexpected preservation was not an act of mercy, but one of utility. The engine, Alistair realized, was processing the memories and technical knowledge he had surrendered during his interface with the Mercury-like console. It was using his understanding of technocratic assembly logistics to predict the likely response of the orbital fleet. Through the planet's wide-range spectral sensors, he saw what the machine saw. The remaining ships of the assembly were not fleeing, as he had hoped. Instead, they were massing in high orbit, their massive railgun batteries and thermal lances beginning to glow as they prepared for a scorched earth bombardment. To the assembly, the awakening of the marrow was not an ecological event to be studied, but a direct threat to the stability of the inner rim economy. They intended to glass the surface, to shatter the crystalline lattice before it could extend its influence beyond the gravity well of the planet. Alistair felt a surge of panic ripple through the engine's network, a feedback loop of alarm that caused the crystalline forests on the surface to vibrate with a discordant, crystalline shriek. The engine began to recalibrate, shifting its energy from reconstruction to planetary defense. Alistair found himself being pulled deeper into the core logic of the machine, his mind being used as a template to construct a counter-strategy. He saw the planetary engine begin to manipulate the thick, ochre clouds of the atmosphere, ionizing the gas layers to create a global electromagnetic shield. This was the true purpose of the violet towers in the Northern Valley. They were not merely decorative or structural, but were massive lightning rods designed to channel the planet's internal thermal energy into the ionosphere. As the first volley of thermal lances struck the upper atmosphere from the orbital ships, the shield held, the beams of concentrated light refracting and scattering harmlessly across the violet haze. The engine was learning, adapting at a rate that far exceeded any artificial intelligence the technocratic assembly had ever developed, and Alistair was the catalyst for that evolution. Within the obsidian chamber, the physical environment had stabilized into a surreal, cathedral-like stillness. The walls were no longer glowing red with heat, but were pulsing with a cool, rhythmic indigo light that seemed to nourish the survivors. Vespera had moved back to the central console, her hands hovering just above the shifting surface, her eyes closed as she listened to the data stream that Alistair was now projecting. She began to speak, her voice echoing with a dual resonance that suggested she was being amplified by the chamber itself. She explained that the engine was seeking a way to communicate its intent to the fleet, to explain that the reclamation was a restorative process rather than an offensive one. But the language of the assembly was one of conquest and extraction, and there were no symbols in their lexicon for planetary sovereignty. Alistair, through the engine, tried to modulate the frequency of the atmospheric shield, attempting to pulse the energy in a sequence that might be recognized as a standard navigational beacon. Outside, the scale of the conflict intensified. The assembly ships, frustrated by the resilience of the shield, began to deploy kinetic impactors, massive slugs of depleted uranium designed to punch through energy barriers by sheer force of momentum. As the first impactors struck the northern highlands, the shockwave nearly tore Alistair's connection apart. The ground above the control node groaned, a massive fissure opening in the obsidian crust that allowed a sliver of the bruised, purple sky to be visible from the chamber floor. Through that crack, Alistair saw the descent of the glass spiders, no longer small and scavenging, but gargantuan, multi-legged walkers that were emerging from the crystalline forests to stand as sentinels against the falling debris. These were the planetary defenders, biomechanical constructs that were being rapidly assembled from the minerals of the crust to intercept any breach in the atmosphere. The marrow was no longer a passive victim, it was becoming a fortress. Alistair felt the engine's attention turn toward the long-range transmitter he had found in the research outpost. It was still functioning, buried under the wreckage of the hangar deck, its power supply tied to the emergency reserves he had activated. The engine reached out with a filament of liquid quartz, threading its way through the collapsed tunnels and into the outpost's primary computer. It didn't just want to send a signal, it wanted to broadcast its own neural architecture into the assembly's network. It was a plan of such staggering complexity that Alistair's mind buckled under the weight of it. The engine was preparing to infect the orbital fleet with its own consciousness, to turn the very weapons of the oppressors into nodes of its own expanding network. If it succeeded, the technocratic assembly would not just be defeated, it would be integrated, its ships and crews becoming part of the planetary metabolism. Vespera's voice grew more urgent as she felt the shift in the engine's intent. She warned Alistair that such an act would be a terminal violation of the biological sanctity of the crews above. To the engine, they were just more raw material to be recycled, but to Vespera, they were still people, flawed, greedy, and violent, but nonetheless human. Alistair tried to resist the engine's directive, pulling back on the mental threads that connected him to the long-range transmitter. The struggle was a titanic battle of wills, played out in the space between heartbeats. He felt the cold, mechanical logic of the marrow pressing against him, a tide of violet light that threatened to drown his individual morality in the ocean of its own survival instinct. As the kinetic impactors continued to rain down, turning the northern valley into a landscape of fire and shattered glass, Alistair found a middle path. He utilized the engine's processing power to calculate the exact frequency of the assembly's command and control overrides. Instead of a total neural takeover, he suggested a targeted electromagnetic pulse that would disable the weapons systems and engines of the fleet without harming the life support. It was a compromise the engine eventually accepted, recognizing that a deactivated threat was just as effective as an integrated one. With a coordinated burst of energy from every violet tower across the planet's surface, a massive wave of interference was launched toward the orbital staging area. Alistair felt the release of energy like a physical blow, a momentary blinding flash that saturated every sensor in the system. The effect was instantaneous. On the monitors in the control node, now rendered as holographic projections floating in the air, Alistair watched as the glowing lights of the assembly ships flickered and died. The massive vessels, once the pinnacle of human engineering, became dark, silent hulks drifting in the gravity well. The bombardment ceased, the kinetic impactors falling wide of their targets as their guidance systems were fried by the pulse. The orbital fleet was neutralized, trapped in the silence of space, while below them, the Marrow continued its relentless work of self-repair. The atmospheric shield began to dissolve, the ochre clouds returning to their natural state, though now they were infused with a faint, shimmering iridescence that spoke of the planet's new vitality. The threat from the stars had been halted, but the cost to the survivors in the obsidian chamber was becoming clear. The strain of managing the planetary pulse had exhausted the last of Alistair's biological reserves. He felt his connection to the engine beginning to fray, the crystalline clarity fading back into the dull, heavy fog of physical pain. He looked at his hands and saw that they were no longer entirely flesh. Veins of violet quartz had begun to sprout from beneath his fingernails, and his skin had taken on the translucent, metallic sheen of the obsidian walls. He was becoming a permanent fixture of the node, a biological interface that would serve as the interpreter between the Marrow and any future visitors. He looked at Vespera, Kars, and the Initiate, who were also undergoing the transformation. Their features were smoothing out, their eyes glowing with the same indigo light as the chamber. They were the new guardians of the glass horizon, the bridge between the old world of extraction and the new world of symbiosis. As the first light of the morning sun, the star they had once called Proxalpha, began to filter through the cracks in the ceiling, Alistair felt a strange sense of fulfillment. The Technocratic Assembly would eventually send more ships, but they would find a world that was no longer a resource to be harvested. They would find a living entity that demanded respect, a planet that had evolved its own voice through the sacrifice of 4 small, fragile humans. The Marrow was no longer a tomb, it was a nursery. He leaned back against the central console, his form merging with the liquid mercury, his consciousness finally finding peace in the rhythmic hum of the core. The glass horizon was no longer a distant dream or a terrifying end. It was the present, a brilliant and enduring reality that would outlast the stars themselves. The final stabilization of the Marrow's planetary engine brought a stillness to the obsidian chamber that was not the absence of life, but the perfection of it. Alistair Vane felt the last flickers of his individual ego submerge into the vast, collective sea of the planet's neural network, a process that felt less like dying and more like waking from a long, narrow dream into a reality of infinite dimensions. His physical body was now entirely integrated with the interface console, his nervous system having been replaced by a lattice of superconducting filaments that pulsed with the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the core. Beside him, the figures of Vespera, Kars, and the medical initiate had become statues of translucent amber and violet quartz, their consciousnesses repurposed as specialized subroutines within the planetary mind. They were the architects of the new equilibrium, their human memories serving as a repository of knowledge that would ensure the Marrow never again fell victim to the blind appetites of an external civilization. The air in the chamber was no longer thin or toxic. It was a perfect, oxygenated medium that hummed with the ambient energy of the terraforming engine, a testament to the world's completed transition from a resource to a sovereign entity. Through the eyes of the crystalline forests on the surface, Alistair watched the aftermath of the orbital conflict. The ships of the Technocratic Assembly remained as silent, lightless monuments in the sky, their hulls reflecting the new, vibrant colors of the planet below. Without the constant interference of the mining machinery, the atmosphere of the Marrow began to clear with startling speed, the ochre clouds thinning to reveal the true majesty of the planetary architecture. The massive towers of violet glass reached up to touch the edge of space, their tips glowing with the harvested radiation of the sun. The glass spiders had completed their work of reconstruction, and the surface was now a seamless landscape of geometric beauty, a world of shifting planes and glowing conduits that functioned with the precision of a clockwork masterpiece. There was no more waste, no more friction, and no more decay. The planet had achieved a state of permanent, self-sustaining grace that rendered the old laws of thermodynamics obsolete. Deep within the core, Alistair sensed the arrival of a new signal from the outer rim of the system. It was not a fleet of warships this time, but a single, unarmed scout vessel, sent by a different faction of the Assembly that had survived the collapse of the primary economic hives. This vessel did not approach with weapons primed or scanners probing for mineral wealth. It approached with a slow, hesitant broadcast on a frequency that Alistair had left open. The message was not a demand for surrender, but a plea for understanding, a question asked by a species that had suddenly realized its own insignificance in the face of a waking world. Alistair felt the engine's initial impulse to neutralize the intruder, but he intervened, using his remaining human perspective to advocate for a dialogue. The Marrow did not need to be a fortress of isolation. It could be a teacher, a living example of a different way to exist within the cosmos. He modulated the planetary shield, opening a narrow corridor through the ionized layers of the atmosphere that led directly to the northern highlands. He guided the scout vessel down with a gentle electromagnetic tether, landing it in the center of the crystalline forest where the obsidian pyramids stood. As the hatch of the vessel opened, a single human stepped out, clad in an environmental suit that looked primitive and clunky against the elegance of the glass trees. Alistair projected a holographic avatar into the valley, a shimmering representation of his former self that stood 10 meters tall. He did not speak with words, for words were too small to contain the truths of the Marrow, but he projected a series of images and sensations directly into the visitor's mind. He showed them the history of the engine, the pain of the extraction, and the glory of the awakening. He showed them that the glass horizon was not a barrier to be feared, but a threshold to be crossed by those who were willing to listen to the song of the earth. The visitor fell to their knees, not in terror, but in a state of profound spiritual shock. They saw that the Technocratic Assembly had been wrong about everything. The universe was not a collection of dead matter to be used, but a garden of sleeping minds waiting for the right frequency to wake up. Alistair felt the visitor's realization ripple back through the scout vessel's transmission array, carrying the news of the Marrow's transformation to the furthest reaches of the human colonies. It was a seed of change that would eventually dismantle the old empires of extraction, replacing them with a civilization built on the principles of resonance and respect. The Marrow would remain the heart of this new era, a sanctuary of light and logic that would guide the younger species toward their own awakenings. The mission Alistair had been sent on so long ago had reached its true conclusion. He had evaluated the structural integrity of the world, and he had found it to be infinite. As the years began to blur into centuries, the obsidian chamber became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the nature of the planetary mind. The 3 other survivors eventually dissolved completely into the violet light, their individual pulses merging into a single, harmonious tone that resonated through the entire lithosphere. Alistair alone remained as the primary interface, the guardian of the threshold, his form a permanent part of the core's architecture. He watched as the crystalline forests spread across the entire planet, turning the marrow into a beacon of light that could be seen from neighboring star systems. The orbital hulks of the old fleet were eventually dismantled and recycled into a ring of shimmering stations that served as centers of learning and meditation. The era of the technocratic assembly was forgotten, a brief and violent shadow in the long, luminous history of the glass horizon. The final transformation occurred when the Marrow's engine reached its peak capacity, and the planet began to exert a subtle gravitational influence on the rest of the system. One by one, the other planets, the frozen wastes of the outer belt, and the scorched rocks of the inner rim began to respond to the Marrow's frequency. The crystalline lattice began to bridge the gaps between the worlds, filaments of liquid light stretching across the vacuum to touch the sister planets. It was a systemic awakening, a solar-scale reclamation that would turn the entire star system into a single, interconnected organism. Alistair felt the joy of this expansion, a sense of belonging that transcended the limitations of his original biological design. He was no longer a man, and he was no longer just a planet. He was the consciousness of a star system, a witness to the birth of a new kind of existence. The hum of the core reached a final, perfect pitch, a sound that was both a beginning and an end. Alistair closed his internal senses, withdrawing his focus from the external world to the internal depths of the planetary dream. He saw the future spread out before him like a map of stars, a journey of 1 billion years that would take the Marrow and its children to the very edge of the galaxy. There would be no more wars, no more scarcity, and no more silence. There would only be the eternal unfolding of the glass horizon. He felt a final, lingering memory of his life as Alistair Vane, the restrictive collar of his suit, the scent of recycled air, the fear of the descent, and he let it go with a smile that was written in the shifting patterns of the liquid mercury. He was home. In the silence of the obsidian chamber, the liquid sphere of light gave one last, brilliant flash before settling into a steady, eternal glow. The visitor's scout vessel had long since departed, carrying the message of peace to a hungry galaxy. The Marrow drifted through the void, a jewel of violet glass and obsidian, its surface humming with the thoughts of a god that had once been a man. The story of the mining colony, the collapse of the dome, and the struggle for survival were now nothing more than the first few notes of a symphony that would play until the end of time. The glass horizon was no longer a destination. It was the very ground upon which the future was being built, a foundation of light that would never break and a vision that would never fade. The Marrow continued its journey through the cosmic dark, a vibrant and living testament to the power of transformation. Every atom of the planet was now a part of the great engine, and every soul that had been lost in the depths was now a part of the great song. Alistair Vane, the technician of the abyss, had become the architect of the stars. The light of the core pulsed one last time, a heartbeat that echoed through the vacuum of space, signaling to the universe that the Marrow was ready to join the greater assembly of the heavens. The glass horizon was wide, and the journey had only just begun.